As Gray mentioned, I'm Cam. I'm the Executive Director of Wild Animal Initiative, and I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about our organization and the kind of research that falls within the scope of our work and the priorities that we set within that scope. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we exist to accelerate science that helps wild animals. We'll talk a little bit more about what that science looks like, but basically we do that through 3 programs. Start with our research program, where we conduct our own research. Most of that has been desk research to date, but we're about to launch our first field research project. We also have a grants program where we fund people at other institutions to do their own research and drive the field forward in their own way. Just to give a quick sense of the scale of that, we've given out about $1.5 million in funding for each of the last 2 years, and we plan to continue at about that scale. The grants that we give out range from $10,000 to $300,000. So there's lots of different kinds of opportunities for research at different stages. And then finally, in our outreach program, we try to reach out to people who might be interested in participating in the field of wild animal welfare science and to support their involvement in the community in a number of different ways. And this workshop is one of those ways. All right, and then quickly just what I mean by wild animal welfare science. Broadly, this is a interdisciplinary research area, but it's united by the common theme of trying to understand and improve the subjective experiences of animals in the wild. We typically break it down into 3 core questions. The first being, how do we measure the welfare of animals in the wild? Obviously, this underpins all of the other work that goes on in the field, and so that's why we've dedicated this workshop series to that subject. The next bundle of questions falls under, what are wild animals' lives like in the wild? And by that I mean, subjectively, from the animal's own point of view, what are their experiences like? What are the most significant sources of pleasure or pain? How frequent are those? How do they compare to each other in intensity? How do those things vary across individuals, populations, species, regions, habitat characteristics, etc.? And then finally, the applied set of questions summarizes, how can we responsibly improve the welfare of wild animals? So given what we found out about threats and opportunities for welfare, what might we be able to do to minimize those threats and maximize those opportunities? And how do we know for sure that those interventions, if we try them, are having the intended effects on the target population? How do we avoid, prevent, and then monitor whether it's having effects on non-target populations? And finally, are there technologies or methodologies that we can develop that would make these kinds of interventions more effective, safer, more scalable, etc.? So that's a really quick overview, not meant to be exhaustive, but hope it gives you a sense of like just how vast this idea space is and how much research possibly could be done under this wide umbrella of wild animal welfare science. And so for the rest of my time here, I'm going to talk about, within that broad area, what we see as Wild Animal Initiative's scope of our work, and within that scope, what things we prioritize, what we particularly emphasize, even if we do work on other things as well. Given a quick teaser here, but I'm just going to move on and talk about each of these in detail. So starting with who has welfare, I'm going to use sentient here to mean having subjective experiences. And welfare definitions do vary, but they all, to my knowledge, include subjective experiences as one component, at least, of the definition. One way that definitions vary, though, is that the sentient experiences in some definitions do not make up the totality of welfare. So some people consider the ability to express natural behaviors, for example, as part of the concept that they're calling welfare. That's, of course, a semantic approach that you could take. From our perspective, we find it most useful to separate those things, to measure things like ability to express natural behavior separately from measuring the subjective quality of animals' experiences, so that if you only care about subjective experiences, you can focus on that. If you care about that and other things, you can decide explicitly what kinds of trade-offs you want to make between those things. So all that just boils down to the outermost scope of our research is that we only study and we only support studies on animals that we believe are sentient or are plausibly sentient. So that would include this adorable bat, because we think there's something that it is like to be a bat. And that would not include this adorable rotifer, which is a microscopic animal that only has a few hundred neurons. And I think there's a good case is very unlikely to be sentient. So I will flag too that this definition, which I'm going to go ahead and say I think is a rather elegant approach to this definition, leads us to a pretty inelegant use of the word animal. Because in the case of wild animal welfare, when we're talking about welfare, we are, that naturally restricts us to animals that have welfare. And so as a consequence, I often end up using animal as a shorthand for animal that is sentient. And apologies to the rest of the animal kingdom. The one consolation there is that I'm quite confident they don't feel offended by the exclusion, because by definition, they can't feel. All right, abundance is another thing that we prioritize, or sort of characteristic that captures a lot of the priorities we have and how we go about our work. And I'm sure there's a more sophisticated way to make this argument, but basically, I think if you're helping animals, it helps to help more animals. And there are a bunch of different kind of heuristics for abundance. One is just the sheer number of wild animals to begin with. So these figures here are adaptations of figures from animal charity evaluators, which recommends charities to animal advocates who want to improve the lives of wild animals. Early in their work, one thing they really prioritized was drawing attention to the plight of farmed animals, and really calling attention to the fact that they received the minority of funding in animal advocacy work, but they represent the vast majority of animals that humans own and use and kill. That being said, you can see in the bottommost figure that even farmed animals pale in comparison to the number of wild animals. So our interest in abundance is what underlies our basic interest in wild animals to begin with. That being said, you'll notice lab animals, not as many as farmed animals, but of course, we definitely still have to take research ethics seriously. Fortunately, Miriam has done a lot of work on research ethics in the context of wildlife. Great website, 3hoursinwildlife.info, and also we're fortunate enough to have her presenting later today. And then one final aspect of abundance, and I think this is the one that is most, I don't know, trickiest for me, and where I feel the most tension, is that common animals are more common by definition than endangered animals. I think what feels tricky to me here is that conservation is something I value, and so this is not a way to say that the conservation of extremely rare animals like this Bali starling are unimportant. It's rather to point out that I think another thing we need to add to the discussion is the experience of common animals, and at least from the perspective of welfare and wildlife management, and trying to make the world a better place from the perspective of animals living in it. Starting with the most common animals seems like a relatively effective approach, because we're more likely to find highly scalable approaches to improving their welfare. All right, and then the final category of prioritization I want to speak to is natural harms versus human harms. So wild animals suffer from human-caused harms, of course. They also suffer from naturally occurring harms. And then there's the combination of those two. So I put the kangaroo here, is trying to escape the aftermath of a forest fire. Forest fires are something that are a natural part of the Australian ecosystem. They're also something that humans start sometimes. And then there are naturally occurring forest fires, like those started by lightning, but exacerbated by conditions caused by climate change. I think from the kangaroo's perspective, these are all concerning to their own welfare, and therefore things that welfare-oriented wildlife managers should consider as well. That being said, while we're interested, our scope would include the full set of potential harms to welfare. We particularly prioritize research on natural harms, primarily because that research seems to be more neglected, but also partly because of this hypothesis that natural harms might actually be more more pervasive than human harms. We don't have the data to prove that, but I'll just go through a couple examples to suggest why that might be the case. So one example is many species have naturally high birth rates, which suggests that in their evolutionary context, they regularly had high rates of mortality. Let's think of these mallards, for example. These ducks, they reach reproductive maturity at 7 months. They have 8 to 13 eggs at a time. They live 5 to 10 years. So even if we just take a the conservative interpretation of that, the lower bounds, let's say they have 8 adorable little ducklings at a time. Let's say they have 4 clutches of young over the span of their lives. In that case, they'd be having 32 young, and on average, in a stable population, only 2 of those would survive and reproduce in adulthood. So this is one of the things that makes us think that there might be, a high occurrence of natural harms even in the absence of humans. And in case that's too dark, I highly recommend Heather's piece on positive wild animal welfare and some points why this might not dominate wild animals' experiences, even if it is an aspect of them. Like great paper. And then finally, here is some actual data from Hill and colleagues. They did a meta-analysis of a whole bunch of studies on specific causes of mortality in different animal taxa across the world. This is something that is definitely understudied, and they make no claims that their data is comprehensive, but or even necessarily proportionally representative. But again, it provides an interesting gut check. So what we have here is for a bunch of different taxa, the proportion of mortality that is caused by humans in black or by natural causes in gray. And as you can see, for almost all of these groups, humans are a substantial cause of mortality. So definitely not something we want to ignore. But natural harms are still also a major aspect, and for all of them, the majority of the causes of death. So death is obviously only one aspect of welfare, but I do think it's interesting to think about the various ways in which naturally occurring harms might exist and might even predominate among human harms. Whether or not they do predominate, it seems like something that we'd like to see more research on. And I'm not going to go into this now, but just in case you're curious, Hill and colleagues also break it down into specific causes of mortality. So I've left this slide in there in case you want to look into that later. All right, so that sums up my overview of wild animal initiative scope and priorities. Again, I want to emphasize that there's the broadest possible scope of wild animal welfare science. Within that, there's the narrower set of things. That's the scope of our work. And within that is the things we tend to prioritize. So just because we prioritize some things doesn't mean we never work on other things. So I've been speaking to naturally occurring harms, for example, but we also definitely want to know what harms humans are causing, and those are often the easiest ones to stop or change. So lots of work to be done in this field, and we're excited to contribute to it and to see others contributing as well.